You were a conscientious objector.
I was, yes, during Vietnam.
What was that process like? I mean, you would have seen firsthand the complexity of humanity right there.
Actually, it was surprisingly easy for me. Oddly enough, I know a lot of guys who tried to get CO status during Vietnam and who were refused it. You know, you probably know some of them because many of them became Canadians.
Yes, they are.
We
welcome them.
When they were turned down, yes. You know, back then it was said that most draft boards, and all the draft boards were local, they would not give you a CO status if you objected to Vietnam. They would only give it to you if you were a complete pacifist and objected to all wars. And I was not a complete pacifist. You know, the big question they would always ask you is, would you have fought in World War II against the Nazis? Well, yes, I would have fought in World War II against the Nazis, but the Viet Cong were not the Nazis, and I didn't think America had any business in Vietnam, and so forth. So I was objecting to that particular war, and everyone told me, well, you'll never get the CO status. But oddly enough, I did get the CO status, and relatively easily. And I learned later my draft board was so conservative that they felt, well, anyone who wanted the CO status should have it, because then he'll be branded forever as a yellow-bellied coward and a traitor, and his life will be ruined, and that would be enough punishment for him. So
thank God for that.
So they ruined my life, and there I am. But no, so I did 2 years alternate service, right, in Vista volunteer, working in legal assistance in Chicago, you know, using my journalism background, and they mostly had me doing public relations and publicizing the cases they were taking. But it was an interesting experience. I got to see a lot of stuff, and I still think the Vietnam War was a terrible mistake for America. But I still would have fought against the Nazis.
Yeah. Do you work that kind of political belief system into the work?
Well, I don't do it deliberately. I mean, I'm not writing an allegory like Tolkien, who, you know, was sometimes accused that Lord of the Rings was an allegory of World War II, which he always reacted to angrily because he didn't believe in that. And either do I. If I want to write about World War II or about Vietnam, I'll write about World War II or about Vietnam. Nonetheless, my beliefs certainly permeate some of Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. Part of it being my belief about war and violence. War is so central to fantasy, so much of high fantasy, and yet it's these bloodless wars where the heroes are killing unending armies of orcs, and the heroes themselves are not themselves ever being killed.
You kill everybody all the time, man. You fall in love with a character and they're dead.
It's true. I mean, I'm guilty of killing people, but you know, I think if you're going to write about war and violence, then show the cost, show how ugly it is, show both sides of it. There's also, I mean, and on the other side, which sometimes gets me in trouble from the other side of the political spectrum, is the glory of war, which those of us who are opposed to war and would rather not have war, tend to forget about or try to pretend it doesn't exist. But if you read the ancient historical sources, people are always talking about the glory of war, the banners that stirred the heart, the banners in the wind, and in medieval days, the night, you know, medieval ages, everything was brown, you know, the clothes were brown, the ground was brown, it was a brown centuries. But the knights would come out in colors. They were the only people rich enough to afford dyed clothing, and they'd be in their blues and their crimsons and their yellows. They must have seemed glorious to the peasants who were coming in their metal suits and going into combat. But then after the battle was finished, there would be like severed limbs everywhere and pools of blood. You read descriptions of the Hastings battlefield after the Battle of Hastings were fought. And, yeah, there literally were like streams of blood and giant pools of blood. There's a lot of blood in a human being. And when you're fighting with these sharp swords and hacking off limbs and, you know, hacking people in the middle of the head, it's not a bloodless exercise.
It's going to come out.
And yeah, it's going to come out. And I think if you're going to write about that period, then you should reflect honestly what it's about and capture both sides of that. You know, whatever emotional stirring we feel when we see the banner proudly flying in the wind and we hear the bugles charge and the drums are beating and the armies surge forward, but also the aftermath.